Have you ever been surprised by secrets revealed at the most unexpected moments? These revelations, true upheavals, can be devastating, but they can also open the way to new beginnings. Maybe you think you already know all the overcoming stories, but this one will challenge everything you know about secrets and hidden truths. What happens when a dark past threatens to destroy everything that has been built? Follow the exciting story of Amara and Tyrell, two lives intertwined by secrets and the incessant search for a better future. This drama full of revelations promises to hold your attention from beginning to end. But it's not just a story of sadness. It's a journey about how altruism can change destinies, even in the face of immense pain. What would you do if you discovered that your greatest admiration is the source of your loved one's suffering? How to face a truth that impacts like a punch, but also reveals a previously invisible path. The reality is that no matter how hard we try to run away, the past always finds us. And when this happens, we have two options: live in a lie or face reality and transform ourselves. This process can be arduous, with everything around you seeming to fall apart. But possibly, it is at this moment that true overcoming emerges. Are you ready to face your challenges and emerge stronger? Come with us on this journey of courage, discovery, and a future beyond imagination. If this introduction has piqued your curiosity, you won't want to miss what comes next. Subscribe to the channel right now, activate the notification bell, and prepare for a journey of discoveries and emotions that go far beyond what you expected. Join us and be part of a community that values true stories of overcoming and transformation. Click sign up and embark on this unique experience. Richard Collins, a renowned businessman, was used to controlling every detail of his life, both at work and at home. For him, everything needed to be impeccable, with no room for flaws. But the unexpected happens when Amara Grant, one of his employees, enters his office, visibly nervous. She carries a secret that is about to change their lives forever. Richard, with a calculated and cold look, hears the revelation. She is pregnant. From him, the silence that follows weighs in the air like a cloud about to collapse. Richard doesn't react. His focus is on keeping his reputation intact, whatever the cost. After all, in his mind, image is everything. He looks at the documents on his desk, as if Amara's presence were just a detail to be resolved. But inside, your brain is already working fast, thinking about how to get rid of that situation without tarnishing your image as an exemplary businessman. The idea of taking on any responsibility does not cross your mind. He sees the pregnancy as a problem that can be solved with one simple decision: fire Amara. Without hesitation, he communicates the decision with the same coldness he uses when negotiating million-dollar contracts. The weight of the news falls on her like a bucket of ice water, but he remains impassive, without a drop of remorse. Amara, in disbelief, tries to argue, looking for a trace of humanity in the man with whom she shared intimate moments. But Richard, unshakable, only sees the risk to his reputation. In his mind, his family, his business, everything needs to be protected. The idea of a scandal involving an employee and a child out of wedlock is inconceivable. He doesn't want to lose control. Amara, standing in front of the table, realizes that she is alone in this battle. The coldness in Richard's eyes leaves no room for negotiations or emotional appeals. She takes a deep breath, already feeling the weight of the overcoming that she will need to face. Richard gets up and opens the door to his office, a subtle but meaningful gesture. He doesn't say it directly, but he makes it clear that there is nothing more to discuss. Amara understands that the meeting is over and that her life has just taken an unexpected turn. She leaves the office with a heavy heart, knowing that what comes next will be arduous. As she walks through the company's corridors, trying to hold back her tears, he goes back to reviewing his papers, as if nothing had happened. For Richard, this episode was just a detail that needed to be erased. What Richard doesn't realize is that this decision will trigger a series of events that he could never control. The coldness with which he treats Amara, his lack of empathy, plants a seed of change that he will later have to harvest. Deep down, he believes that he can continue his life without consequences, that the situation will resolve itself. But reality always has a way of taking its toll. While he continues with his plans, Amara begins to face a new journey, full of challenges, but also of hope. And that's where the game really begins. She knows she will have to fight alone. Richard, focused on keeping up appearances, dismisses her as someone who no longer fits into his perfect world. Amara, now unemployed and pregnant, feels the harshness of being left aside by someone who had a privileged place in her life. But the strength that builds in his chest is something Richard could never predict. Little by little, she begins to realize that there is no other way but to move forward, no matter how difficult it is. And with each day that passes, she clings to the idea that the future can still hold something good. While Richard returns to his life of luxury and meetings, believing his problem is gone, Amara deals with the real consequences. He continues to smile at his partners and participate in gala events, while she faces the difficulties of being a single mother, ignored by the society he values so much. For him, keeping up the facade is everything. For her, the fight for survival is what matters. Richard doesn't know it yet, but life has a curious way of connecting the destinies of those he believed he had erased from his history. The sense of power and control that Richard feels when he fires Amara is just a fleeting illusion. As he seeks to protect his reputation, Amara discovers that she needs more than a job to survive. She needs to overcome. She needs to transform her pain into something that makes her move forward. Every day, she learns to deal with fear and uncertainty, searching her heart for inspiration that motivates her to continue. And meanwhile, Richard continues to believe that he is in charge, without imagining that destiny is preparing something very different for him. But what Richard can't predict is that, years later, the Grant name will come back to haunt him in ways he could never imagine. While he enjoys his power and prestige, Amara's story is just beginning to intertwine with his own again. He, who always believed he could escape the consequences of his actions, will soon discover that some ghosts from the past don't disappear so easily. And it is at this point that the story begins to gain new layers, revealing what is to come.
Hello, this is Jimmy, the channel's writer. He wants to help us acquire more tools to improve video production. Subscribe to the channel, click like, and follow the other videos on the channel. Embark on this journey of spreading teachings around the world.
Amara left Richard's office with an emptiness in her chest that seemed to swallow everything around her. The feeling of being dismissed as a problem to be solved, left a deep mark. But reality didn't leave time for regrets. Without a job, and with the news of her pregnancy still resonating in her mind, she had to get back on her feet. Every morning was a new challenge, but she clung to the hope of a better future. After all, overcoming always begins in the most difficult moments, when the ground disappears from beneath our feet, and all that remains is to fight. The first months were the most difficult. Looking for a job in her field seemed like a maze with no way out. Each closed door reminded her of Richard's power and his influence on the market. He had silently banished her, making it clear that there was no place for her in that corporate world. Amara, however, refused to give up. Even in the face of difficulties, she looked for temporary work and started saving every penny, trying to build a small safety cushion. Humility was his best ally, adapting to jobs he never imagined accepting. Between one job and another, Amara found herself rediscovering skills she had forgotten. She reinvented herself day after day, learning the importance of adapting to the needs of life. With each passing day, she felt the presence of the new life she carried, and it gave her strength. If she needed inspiration, all she had to do was place her hand on her belly and remember that she was no longer alone. The drama of his situation was constant, but behind the tears was a desire for victory. It wasn't just a question of surviving. It was about ensuring her child had a dignified future. The reality of being a single mother imposed itself in an overwhelming way. The bills started piling up, and the routine of going to interviews and receiving negative responses became a test of patience and resilience. Still, Amara found moments to dream, to imagine herself in a better life. She wondered what it would be like to raise a child without anyone's support, and that uncertainty made her hesitate for a moment. But he soon remembered that life was full of twists and turns, and that destiny sometimes held surprises for those who didn't give up. In the midst of this storm of uncertainty, Amara found support in small acts of altruism, from strangers and old friends alike. A neighbor who offered a hot meal, a friend who was willing to take care of her during the most difficult days. These gestures reminded her that there was still kindness in the world, and that kindness was a reminder that no matter how many doors Richard had closed, others could be opened. It was a lesson that she carried in her heart, and that made her believe that her effort would be rewarded. Amara's routine turned into a daily battle, but she didn't allow discouragement to dominate her for long. She learned to live one day at a time, to accept that overcoming was a slow process, but that each step taken was a victory. Little by little, she also allowed herself to dream again, imagining a future where her son could grow up in a safe and nurturing environment, far from Richard's shadows. Even though she didn't know how, she promised herself she could do it. Between sleepless nights and days of struggle, Amara began to realize a strength in herself that she never imagined existed. She became stronger with each new no, with each unanswered interview. And although despair knocked on the door from time to time, she always found a reason to move forward. The feeling of carrying a new being inside her, of knowing that that little beating heart depended on her, was what got her up every day. It was a huge weight, but also a driving force that no one could take away from her. To deal with the pain and rejection, Amara began to seek inspiration in books that talked about resilience and stories of overcoming. One of her favorites was The Courage to be Imperfect by Brené Brown, which helped her understand that vulnerability could be a strength, not a weakness. She was also inspired by stories of women who, like her, had faced the impossible and found a new reason to smile. It was like this, between one reading and another, she renewed her hopes. Despite all the difficulties, Amara did not lose her desire to help others. Even without resources, she made a point of supporting other women in similar situations, sharing job tips or just offering a word of comfort. This humility and selflessness made her feel that somehow her pain was being transformed into something positive, and that gave him a new meaning to continue. While Richard continued his life of luxury, Amara built, brick by brick, a new perspective for the future. But no matter how hard Amara tried to put the past behind her, the memories of that day in Richard's office still haunted her. Sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she relived the moment when he dismissed her without hesitation, his cold and calculated gaze. It was as if a part of her was still waiting for an explanation, for redemption. She knew she needed to move on, but one question kept lingering in her mind. Would Richard ever face the consequences of his actions? Years have passed since that fateful day, and life has taken its course, but the marks remain. Tyrell, now a promising young man, graduated with honors and landed a job at the renowned Collins Associates, without realizing that the company's owner, Richard Collins, was his father. Amara, who fought so hard to guarantee her son's future, felt a mixture of pride and concern when she heard the news. She never told Tyrell about the past she shared with Richard. The truth weighed heavily on her heart, but she chose to remain silent, fearing that it might take Tyrell away from his big dream. On the first morning of work, Tyrell woke up early, full of expectations. He put on his best suit, straightened his tie in front of the mirror, and left the house with a smile on his face. Upon arriving at the company, the young man noticed the grandeur of the place, the wide corridors and the serious faces of his colleagues. He was determined to prove himself, to prove that, even though he came from humble beginnings, he had the potential to make a difference. Little did he know that he was about to encounter a shadow from the past that would change everything. During the first few weeks, Tyrell stood out, impressing his supervisors with his dedication and intelligence. Little by little, he began to gain visibility, being noticed even by company executives. Amara, in turn, watched from afar, anxious and proud, but there was one fear she couldn't shake. What would happen if Richard found out that Tyrell was his son? With each phone call from Tyrell, telling her about the progress in his new job, Amara felt a mixture of happiness and a knot in her stomach. It was on one of these ordinary work days that Tyrell had his first contact with Richard. Passing through the company's corridors, he came across the man he had already seen in photos, but who he didn't know was his father. Richard, for a brief moment, stopped when he heard the young man's surname mentioned by one of the supervisors, Grant. His eyes narrowed, a distant memory appeared, but he soon put the thought aside, returning to his fast pace. For Tyrell, it was just a meeting with the CEO, but for Richard, something started to stir in his mind. When he got home that night, Tyrell couldn't wait to tell his mother the news. "Mom, you won't believe it. Today Richard Collins himself passed me in the hallways. I think he noticed me," he said, excited, without imagining the impact his words would have on Amara. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but she managed a smile, hiding the tension that invaded her chest. He knew he couldn't keep the secret for long, but he also feared what it would mean for Tyrell. How to tell your son that the man he admired so much was, in fact, responsible for his greatest pain? The days passed and Amara fought against her own thoughts. With each new achievement Tyrell made at Collins Associates, she knew she was closer to needing to reveal the truth. She saw the sparkle in her son's eyes when he talked about work, about the opportunities that finally seemed to arise after years of sacrifices. Tyrell didn't understand why there was concern in her eyes. He thought it was just a mother's natural fear. But Amara carried a greater weight, a certainty that this secret could not stay hidden forever. One afternoon, while they were having coffee together, Tyrell mentioned an important dinner that Richard himself would be attending. Amara was silent for a moment, thinking about how many twists and turns life took. She knew this dinner could be a turning point, but she wasn't ready to reveal the truth yet. Instead, she just asked her son to be cautious, to stay focused on what was really important. Tyrell found the advice intriguing, but didn't ask many questions. He still didn't know that the story that awaited him at that dinner would be much more complex than he imagined. During dinner, Tyrell tried to get closer to Richard, eager to make a good impression. But what he didn't know was that, in that same elegant room, there was a game of glances between Richard and Amara, who watched from afar, without being noticed. Amara knew she needed to prepare her son for what was to come, but she felt there was still time. Richard, in turn, felt an uneasiness growing in his chest. That young man with the familiar surname seemed to be more than just a dedicated employee. It was as if the pieces were starting to fall into place, but he still couldn't see the whole picture. Tyrell, on the other hand, felt increasingly part of that world. He believed that, finally, his life was on the right path, far from the difficulties he and his mother faced. He didn't know it, but he was walking on shaky ground, where every step could reveal hidden truths. Amara, at home, tried to convince herself that she had made the right choice by keeping the secret, but doubts continued to haunt her, like shadows on sleepless nights. And meanwhile, Richard began to discreetly investigate, curious about this new employee. What no one expected was that, in the near future, all these stories would abruptly intersect. Tyrell was about to discover that his entire life had been marked by a lie, and that the man he saw as an example of success was, in fact, responsible for his mother's most difficult nights. Amara knew the moment of truth was near, but she feared the impact it would have on Tyrell. Richard, in turn, was about to see his life turn upside down, without imagining that the storm was already forming on the horizon. The night of the dinner arrived, and Tyrell, still unaware of the approaching storm, was eager to prove himself. In the room lit by elegant chandeliers, glasses clinked and conversations flowed. But for him, the focus was on impressing Richard. When he finally had the chance to get closer, the young man felt a chill run down his spine as he noticed Richard's enigmatic expression upon hearing his surname once again. Grant. Richard disguised it, but an uneasiness was growing inside him. That name, those features, something there was wrong, something he couldn't ignore. Tyrell could not have predicted that, As they exchanged polite words, from across the room, Amara watched, trying to muster the courage she needed to tell her son the truth. What she had hidden for so many years now seemed impossible to keep. When she saw Richard stare at Tyrell with that unreadable look, Amara knew that the mask of secrecy she had built was about to fall. The feeling that everything was on the verge of a major upheaval made her heart race, and she decided she couldn't wait any longer. After dinner, Amara called Tyrell for a talk. It was the first time she looked at her son, knowing that her life was about to change forever. She hesitated, the words caught in her throat, but when she saw the excitement in his eyes as he talked about Richard, she knew she couldn't hide it any longer. "Tyrell, I need to tell you something about Richard Collins," she began, her voice shaking. The boy frowned, confused. That phrase echoed in his mind like an omen of something he never expected to hear. Amara told everything, from the moment she revealed her pregnancy to Richard, to the day he coldly dismissed her, with words that still echoed in her mind. Every detail seemed to open a new wound in Tyrell's heart as he listened in silence, his fists clenched at his sides. He felt his mother's pain in every word, but also a growing anger against the man he had, until then, admired. "He's your father, Tyrell," Amara said, letting the tears finally fall. The revelation fell like an unbearable weight between them. Tyrell stood up abruptly, eyes glassy, trying to absorb the truth he had just discovered. The person he thought was an example of success and leadership was, in fact, responsible for all of his mother's suffering. The shock made his legs shake, and he needed a moment to process it. "Why didn't you tell me sooner, Mom? Why did you let me work for him without knowing any of this?" The questions were filled with hurt, but Amara knew that this was just the beginning of a journey that they would need to face together. The next morning, Tyrell made a decision. He couldn't continue living with that lie. He needed to confront Richard, face him as an equal. If he had inherited anything from that man, it would not be coldness, but the strength to face his fears. He went to Richard's office, but didn't find him there. He then decided to wait for the right opportunity, and learned that Richard would be at dinner with his family that same night. It was there that he would put everything on a clean plate, in front of everyone, with no more hiding places. When Tyrell entered the restaurant, his presence made itself known. Richard was with his family, in a moment that should have been peaceful, but when he saw Tyrell approaching, something changed. Richard's expression morphed from surprise to a stiffness that made it clear he knew something wasn't right. Tyrell didn't waste time with polite words. He got straight to the point. "Do you know who I am, Richard?" Tyrell's voice was firm, and the silence that followed was almost palpable. All eyes in the restaurant turned to them, curious about the unusual scene. Richard tried to maintain his composure, but his gaze betrayed the tension he felt. "Tyrell, I don't think this is the place for that kind of conversation," he said, trying to deflect attention. But Tyrell didn't back down. He stared at Richard with the intensity of someone who has a heavy truth to tell. "You know me, yes, and you know my mother very well. You know exactly what you did 24 years ago, when you decided that our existence was a problem that could be dismissed." The revelation shook Richard's bones, and he turned pale, unable to respond immediately. Tyrell's words resonated like a blow to Richard's heart, and for an instant, the powerful man found himself unarmed before the young man. Richard's wife, Catherine, and his other son, Elijah, looked at him with expressions of disbelief, as if the perfect world they knew was crumbling before their eyes. Catherine held Richard's hand, confused, demanding an explanation, and at that moment, Richard realized that there was no longer any way to escape the consequences of his actions. Tyrell, his chest full of sorrow, knew that this was just the beginning of a long reckoning. What came next was an exchange of glances that said more than any words. Tyrell and Richard, father and son, separated by years of lies, were now face to face with a truth neither could ignore. Richard's family, once oblivious to his dark past, was beginning to understand that there was much more to the story than what they had heard over the years. Tyrell knew there was no going back. From then on, things would never be the same, neither for him nor for Richard. Tyrell's revelation had an immediate and devastating impact. Richard, once imposing and self-assured, saw his life fall apart before the eyes of his family and restaurant patrons. The heavy silence was broken only by the sound of rapid breathing, as Catherine looked at her husband as if he were a complete stranger. Elijah, who had always admired his father, now looked at him with a mixture of anger and disappointment. Tyrell stood his ground, but inside, he felt the whirlwind of emotions. He didn't want it to be like this, but he knew the truth needed to be told. Richard, for his part, seemed more vulnerable than ever. Richard tried to regain control of the situation, as he had always done in his business, but realized this battle was different. Tyrell, it wasn't that simple. You need to understand. He tried to explain, but his words sounded hollow. Tyrell showed no interest in hearing excuses. The coldness Richard displayed years before was now a mirror reflecting back his own indifference. Catherine, who until then had been holding her husband's hand, slowly released it, as if she were letting go of the remaining fragments of trust. Richard realized that this time he had no control over the outcome. Catherine demanded a full explanation. She wanted to understand how the man who swore to be loyal to his family could have hidden such a devastating secret for so long. Richard, what else are you hiding from us? Her words were like knives, cutting through whatever illusion remained. Richard, cornered, found himself with no way out. He tried to justify his actions, saying he wanted to protect his family and his own career. But each excuse sounded emptier than the last. Tyrell realized that, behind that successful businessman attitude, there was a fragile man, full of fear. Tyrell felt this was the time to confront Richard about all the pain he and his mother had carried. You destroyed my mother's life, Richard. She was left with nothing, while you continued to build your company, your family, your name. And now you want to justify it as if it was all a misunderstanding. Tyrell's voice was filled with hurt, but also with a determination that Richard hadn't expected to find. The restaurant, which previously seemed like an elegant setting, now became the stage for a story that no one there imagined witnessing. Richard realized he was losing much more than his image. He looked around and saw that the faces of strangers watching him held no admiration but silent judgment. He, who always knew how to deal with the looks of critics and investors, now found himself powerless in the face of his own past. Tyrell's words were like a mirror, showing him the mistakes he tried to forget. But for Tyrell, this was more than a chance to expose the truth. It was an opportunity to finally close a painful chapter in his life and his mother's life. Catherine, visibly shaken, stood up from the table, tears falling uncontrollably. I can't believe you did this, Richard. Was everything we lived through based on a lie? Her voice was shaking, and Richard reached out to try and comfort her, but she backed away. Elijah, who until then had been watching silently, finally exploded. Dad, how could you? You always taught us to be honest, to work hard, and now I discover that you are a hypocrite. Elijah's statement hit Richard hard, revealing that he had lost the trust of those who mattered most to him. Richard realized there was no escaping the consequences. The weight of his actions had finally caught up to the present, and he could no longer hide behind excuses and justifications. In an unexpected move, he lowered his head and admitted, I made a terrible mistake. I thought I could erase the past, but now I see I was wrong. But words of repentance were not enough to heal the wounds of decades of abandonment. Tyrell felt a mix of satisfaction and emptiness when he saw Richard finally face his failures, but he knew that nothing could erase the suffering he and his mother went through. The next day, news of Richard's dismissal spread throughout the Collins Associates office. The company he built with so much effort now needed to move on without him. The decision to resign was inevitable as his position as CEO became untenable. Rumors about the confrontation in the restaurant spread through the company's corridors, and Richard's image, once impeccable, was now tarnished by scandals. Tyrell, who previously saw the company as a symbol of overcoming, now questioned whether this was still where he should be. Tyrell returned home and found Amara waiting for him, with a look of mixed concern and pride. He told everything that happened, every detail of the confrontation and the consequences that followed. Amara hugged him, knowing that from then on, they would need to find a new path together. Richard, in turn, faced the void left by the loss of his position and the trust of his family. The perfect life he built for himself crumbled before his eyes, as he tried to understand how to deal with the consequences of his past. The pain he had inflicted on those around him now returned with a vengeance. Richard's life would no longer be the same, but Tyrell also knew that he and his mother needed to decide what they would do from that point on. The truth had been revealed, but the scars of the past were still there, pulsing. Tyrell looked at Amara and felt that there were still many unanswered questions, many feelings to be processed. But for the first time in a long time, he felt he had the power to decide the direction of his life. And while they were planning their next steps, a new journey opened up, full of uncertainty, but also of hope. Now that you know this story of twists and turns and overcoming, it's time to think about how it can reflect on your own life. Have you faced challenges head-on, like Tyrell and Amara, or have you avoided dealing with those secrets that weigh on your chest? Facing the truth is never easy, but it is the only way to free yourself and build a new path. It's not about seeking perfection, but about finding strength where there was only fear before. What if it were you in their place? What would you do if you discovered that the person you trusted hid something so important? Life gives us choices, and true transformation begins when we find the courage to face what scares us most. Maybe it's time for you to also allow yourself to confront your own ghosts and, who knows, discover that there is much more than pain waiting for you. Overcoming is a path, not a destination, and it starts when you decide to take the first step. So, how about starting this change right now? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to continue following stories like this and learn more about how to transform your life. With each new video, a new chance to reflect and find the inspiration you need to move forward. Because at the end of the day, what really matters is how you get back up after every fall. Let's go on this journey together. You are one click away from discovering how to reach the next level.